Hey there, I hope you're well. My name is Patrick. I am a graphic artist and motion designer based in Berlin. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of making the music video that I made for Peter Kirn, who some of you might know runs the tech platform Create Digital Music. So let's just jump right into it. Okay, so let's start by looking at the Nodegraph and how I've organized everything here. Basically, I've split the Nodegraph into 4 quadrants with the root at the center right here. Let's take a look at this in a clockwise manner, starting with the top right area here. So in this area, we have all the 3D objects, which I've labeled and placed in regions. The rest are either particle systems, cloner systems, or some post effects like glow. We'll take a closer look at some of the 3D objects later. So now moving on to this bottom right area, this is where I initially started adding content. So the main corridor 3D object that makes up the scene is here, right in this region. You'll also find the 3D floating body over here, and then there's some floor lighting in a cloner system that I added to enhance the mood of the corridor. So next in this bottom left area, we have the lights in the scene. I didn't bake any lights for this project, so it's all dynamic lighting. There's a lot of volumetric light going on with shadow maps, and this definitely helps thicken the mood of the scene, but at the cost of frame rate, which takes a hit. I'm going to take a closer look at the lights a bit later and explain what to look for in the parameters when optimizing the lights and shadow work. Now finally up here in this top left area, we have an array of cameras linked to a select child node. And doing this means you can cycle through them if you press 0 and then hit the corresponding number of each camera. I added a lot of camera angles to give a more cinematic feel and loose narrative build. I find it keeps things interesting, and it also maximizes the different interpretations of the scene just by changing the focal length or field of view of what you're looking at. Okay, now on to the 3D objects that make up the scene. So all of the 3D objects featured in the scene are downloaded from Sketchfab, which is a great resource of 3D model assets that are, for the most part, already all optimized for real-time playback. Some authors are nice enough to have their works downloadable for free, so I recommend digging around and see what you can find. So here's the page of the author where I got the corridor scene. The previewer gives you a pretty good idea on how the model should look in your scene once all the textures are applied correctly. Now, this 3D floating spacesuit character that's kind of the centerpiece of the scene is from the website Mixamo, which is another great resource of free to download 3D biped characters featuring a library of animation loops. And I got this model and applied the floating animation and exported it as an FBX. Then did some minor texture edits in Notch, giving it like this transparent skin look. Okay, so now let's take a look at the corridor scene file. When you download the scene file from Sketchfab, it comes as an FBX along with a set of PBR textures, which stands for Physically Based Rendering. If you're already familiar with PBR textures and workflows, this should be familiar to you, but I found working with PBR textures greatly improves the visual quality of a scene without a huge cost on performance. Basically, what you need to do is import the PBR textures and pipe them in the material node of the 3D model file. Notch will read the UV texture mapping data from the 3D model, so normally it should map over correctly, and all you have to do is pipe in each PBR image texture to their corresponding texture channel, starting with base color, then normals, roughness, metalness, emissive, and ambient occlusion. Eventually, the model will reveal itself in all its PBR glory if you've used all the textures. So with the corridor scene done and integrated, I repeated this process again with all the models I used to fill in the scene. What I've done is import each model on a separate layer as shown here in the timeline. I found doing this gives you the option to have an isolated look at the model before integrating it to the main scene, where it would be a lot busier and harder to navigate through all the nodes already in the scene. So now with all the models in place, I added math modifiers to the positions and rotation parameters to give the illusion of them floating around in zero gravity. In some cases, I applied the modifiers to a null point, which acts as a 0 point of the 3D object. Initially, I wanted to have all these floating objects in a rigid body system so they could slowly collide into each other, but I couldn't get this to work properly, but it's something I will look into next time. I found the math modifiers gave the object's movements the necessary predictable position and rotation loops for camera work, so this works out well in the end. Next, I want to briefly cover these flat screens I added that add to this feeling of something went wrong in the space situation. They basically feature a screen recording I did of various current pandemic data I found online. It's piped into a color texture of the material node of a shaped 3D plane. Then I added a classic digital block glitch effect from the post effect nodes to complete the look. Alright, so now on to the lights, which I find to be really the most important part of the scene, as it really helps give that convincing, thick, and haunting atmosphere, similar to a lot of classic sci-fi. And dynamic volumetric lighting takes a huge cost on performance, but it's worth it if it carries your scene to new depths. So let's take a look at the node here labeled Volumetric 1, which is a light on the outer hall of the corridor, sweeping across the windows at regular intervals. Now, if you look at the parameters, I've found shadow map size has a big influence on the look, as well as shadow softness. This light node works in combination with the volumetric lighting node. So looking into the parameters of the node, I would pay attention to max depth range and number of depth slices. I have experimented with the setting here until I got a decent balance of performance and the look of soft light rays pouring into the windows and falling onto the corridor floor. So next we have the particle trails emanating from the floating body. This would also be the focal point of the scene. The 3D floating body acts as the mesh emitter, sending the particles to a mesh attractor, which is a copy of the same 3D floating body. These long strands are actually quite tricky, although there is a formula to follow. I think every case is a little different, so I would probably try to rework this. The point was mainly to have them grow very slowly, so I added a time stretch node here to slow down the speed and have the strands drag out. And lastly, we have the cameras. Adding cameras is quite an important step because this is where you will get a narrative cinematic quality to the scene. I didn't end up using all the camera angles I worked out, but most of them are used. I found it important to diversify the scene with a lot of camera angles, but I ended up using a lot of very wide angles to take in as much of the space as possible, so some of the angles are also quite disorienting. One attribute I would pay attention to in the camera parameters is near clip. I set this to almost 0, otherwise objects near it would cut off before they collide into it. I only noticed this issue when I exported my movie renders, so it's worth to take note. So that's the end of the run-through. I hope that was useful to you and gives you an idea on my process working in Notch. With that said, the download link to the project file should be in the video description or on my website, along with links to some of the Sketchfab assets that I used. Thank you, enjoy, and keep creating.